Hi, folks. So this is only the second time I have ever used PowerPoint in my life or in my career as a student or as a lecturer, so I hope this works appropriately. I am a notoriously lo-fi lecturer. I use whiteboards and markers, and that's it. So, God willing, everything will work according to plan. As Dr. Tate had suggested, the general purpose of this lecture series is to encourage not just lecturers, but also students to use the materials that are available to all of us in the West Indiana and Special Collections Unit. And given that that is the case, and given the fact that it appears that the majority of people in this room are students, I would like to address my remarks especially to you students, and give you some potential suggestions or prompts or inspiration for digging through those collections on your own and figuring out how you can make that material that is available to you work for you in the assignments that you have to do for your classes, or even, God willing, if you're just curious about the places that you live and the places that you work and so on. I'm super excited to hear a lecture about the Maracas Valley because I live in the Maracas Valley. So if you look at the maps, you can see representations on paper form of the places that you notice every day that you walk by or drive by and so on. And if you've ever wondered, for example, I wonder what that hill's name is, right? And you haven't found anyone who can give you that information. You can find that information in the West Indiana and Special Collections Unit, if that information is available. So I would encourage you to check it out, and I'm going to, again, address my remarks especially to you, to students, because I know sometimes the perception is that, well, going into the archives is something that professional researchers do. And that is not necessarily the case. You all have access to this extraordinarily diverse collection of materials that people elsewhere in the world simply do not have because the archives have been destroyed, as, for example, in Liberia, which is a country where I do a lot of work related to, for example, or in other places where people have simply ignored their history for this or that reason. You have an extraordinary resource available to you, and I encourage you to make use of it. With that said, my specific intention right now is to give a kind of preliminary look at a particular kind of map, and that is a tourist map. And I'm going to look at tourist maps from an explicitly literary perspective. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is partly because I'm mostly an Africanist, which is to say most of my research and teaching revolves around Africa, not the Caribbean. But what I can say is that I am a guest, and that you all are hosts. And if I know anything about trying to navigate Trinidad and Tobago, for example, it is that the countless number of commercial tourist maps that are available to you almost never look the same, rarely have the street names listed as they are appropriately so, and in fact, oftentimes when you are a new visitor to a place, whether it is a tourist or a longer-term guest, sometimes you use tourist maps to get lost, not to be found. So, with that said, as a literary critic, as a literary scholar, I tend to regard all artifacts, including maps, as narratives that convey stories. Various features on maps are then, therefore, analogous to various literary elements, basic literary elements that we take for granted. So, for example, the places and the spaces that are represented on a map are, in a way, analogous to the physical settings for potential events and activities that together constitute a plot in a story. The tourists and locals who are either represented visually or who are implicitly present within those maps are the characters within that story. The visual cues in a map, from the icons that are used to the advertisements that are often increasingly imposed upon that map space, are themes that help to define the tourist location. And finally, the labels and descriptions that we find on maps, from the legend and informational cutouts and so on and so forth, they are the discourses through which tourists can make meaning of their experiences. So, my particular focus, again, is tourist maps, but I'm going to be looking at an even more narrow subgenre, and that is tourist maps that aren't very good as tourist maps. In other words, tourist maps of limited utility, which tourists or rather, they inadequately serve the purpose of a tourist map. I'm going to look at 3 maps and then some other information aside from that in this talk. One is a map from Montserrat, another is from Grenada, and then finally we're going to get local and I will talk about Tobago. So, without further ado, let's get to our first map. This is a typical tourist map of Tobago, which was published in 1996. It is titled The Journey Now Start, and it features all of the practical functions that we would expect from a tourist map. That is to say, it helps visitors identify major tourist attractions, it helps visitors plan daily activities during their stay, and it helps visitors navigate unfamiliar spaces. Now, other maps may have other functions. A geological map, for example, provides you with information about the geological phenomena in that space that is represented. A nautical chart has its own purposes as well. I don't know how to sail, so I don't know what they do. But they do have a purpose, right? Map features, in other words, the elements that you see on that map space are supposed to reflect the function of the map. So a tourist map must identify tourist attractions in order to be a tourist map. Now, to use an analogy from literature, because again, I am a literary critic, the presence of a crime in a novel does not make that a crime novel or a work of detective fiction. And similarly, a representation of spaces for tourism on a map does not necessarily mean that you have a tourist map. So, to give you an example of how this works in practice, and again, to put maps up on a PowerPoint, sometimes you don't get all the visual detail. So I'm going to move over to this map in a moment and show you what's going on here. I'm just going to shout and hope that you can hear what I'm saying. But let me give you a sense of what's going on with this tourist map. This is a survey. Oh, look at that. I feel like I'm in a TED Talk. This is a map of Montserrat. It is a survey map that has been repurposed by the government for use by tourists. And the reason why I say that it has been repurposed is that the survey map provides different information and it has different usefulness as a map than a tourist map might. So while it's difficult to see, it's a little easier to see here with a cutout of the town of Plymouth. Every single building in the town of Plymouth, whether it is a personal residence or a restaurant or a bank or a police station or whatever, every single building is represented in this map. That is not typical of your average tourist map, because your average tourist map isn't interested in pointing out, hey, that's where Mr. Smith lives, for example. Rather, you want to know where the locations are that you have read about in your tourist guides or on your tourist websites, and so on and so forth. There's elevation information, and this is very, very detailed information. Unfortunately, it's hard to represent in this form. But if you go to the special collections, you can check it out. The idea here, though, is that there is a lot of information that is presented here that is of limited value to tourists. And in fact, even this little key down here, which says locations, not destinations, incidentally, which is interesting to me. The locations that are identified here are, for example, a restaurant, and it says you can go to H4 in order to find that restaurant, but it's not labeled as, so-and-so's Chinese restaurant, or so-and-so's, like Calypso Cafe. It is just labeled as restaurant. So you have no idea where you're going or what's going to happen when you get there. This is, in other words, a map that is ostensibly a tourist map of Montserrat, but in fact it doesn't provide many of the features that one would expect or associate with that genre of maps. Now, you may see on that left-hand column that it says Montserrat is the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean. Do any of you know why it's referred to as the Emerald Isle? One of the reasons is that many early settlers to that island were of Irish ancestry. And so even today, many of the surnames that are used on the island are of Irish origin, right? Also, Christopher Columbus, who, supposedly, quote-unquote, discovered the island, said that it reminded him of the land around Montserrat in Spain. And so he said that land was particularly green and lush and beautiful, And that is why the name of the island is as it is. Now, there is a kind of now this map was published in 1978, so this is prior to the commercial internet, but there's almost like a Wikipedia entry, so to speak, on the left-hand column in which we are provided information like a short history and geological and weather information and generalized attractions. For example, and I quote, the island features a number of attractive bays. Who knows where those bays are, right? But more broadly, this artifact fails as a tourist map because it does not provide a sense of the place of Montserrat. You don't get a sense of what Montserrat is like by looking at this map. The human experience of place, in other words, is subordinated to the scientific descriptions of the space. And that is a distinction that I'd want you to pay attention to. Now, the second map that I want to look at, and we're going to focus on it in more detail because of how ridiculous it is Grenada, the Isle of Spices. This is a map that was published in 1985, and it is representative, I think, of maps that overload the senses and cease to function as a practical guide. On the one hand, this map does help visitors identify major tourist attractions. It does help visitors plan daily activities during their stay. But on the other hand, it is a terrible navigational tool. It is printed, if you go to the special collections and mess with it, it is printed on heavy cardstock. It is in a hand-painted appearance. And what that means is that it's more really a souvenir or a travel artifact than a tourist map. It is a product of tourism, in other words, rather than an aid for the tourist. Now, Grenada is represented as a visual spectacle here that invites the tourist's gaze. And that is a term that people who do research on tourism, on tourist maps, particularly like. Here's a definition for you. This gaze is formulated in part through the collection of already existing representations of the tourist's destination. Representations that promise a contrast from the tourist's everyday routines of work and home. Armed with such a set of preconceived notions, the tourist travels to seek out and collect the representations that define a particular tourist gaze. The gaze becomes a lens through which the tourist experiences sights and cultures and identities as different from his or her own. And this map of Grenada offers tourists confirmation of the stereotypical Caribbean setting. So you get palm-lined beaches, right? You have exotic fruits and activities. You even have in the lower right-hand corner there, lost treasure, as if going to Grenada in 1985 gives you the opportunity to unearth pirates' gold. All right? Now, despite the fact that it is a bad navigational tool, the map does provide tourists with the opportunity to tangibly bring their experience home with them. On the one hand, that means that it extends the initial experience that they had in Grenada after they leave. The map serves in this respect as a kind of a manuscript that is both edited and also actualized through travel into a story that will inevitably be revised with each telling as the visitor narrates after returning home to their friends and family, and each time is filtered through his or her memory. In other words, every time they look at this map, it not only provides them with a guide with what they may have done, but it also is, or rather the story changes with every telling as your memory begins to gain new information after you have left and forgotten the things or the more boring or mundane activities or the terrible things you blocked out of your mind, after you return home again. It also, though, serves as a mnemonic device, and I'm so proud I pronounced that word properly because it's the hardest word in the English language. A mnemonic device to narrate self-identity. In other words, it helps your memory. I bathed at the world's most famous bathing beach. I explored the almost totally unexplored Grenadines. I romanced in the most romantic island in the West Indies, to use the language, the excessive language on this map, right? The setting of Grenada invests those events then with special significance. Otherwise mundane activities, though romance is never mundane, but otherwise mundane activities acquire new meanings because they take place in an exotic location. In other words, you could bathe in a pond, right, in rural Georgia. You could bathe in a swimming pool in New York City, but bathing in the world's most perfect bathing beach in Grenada invests that activity, going for a swim, with new significance, right? Now that said, each cutout image here is more than just a setting, if we're going to use the language of literary criticism. It is also a potential or an actual scene in the story in which the tourist participates. Potential, by which I mean maybe if we go to Concord Falls, we can swim in the pools, right? That is a possible action that we could take that forms a basis of our story in Grenada. Or actual, hey, remember that crazy American dude we met at the St. James's Hotel, right? So these events that take place in these spaces form the story in our minds that we play out whenever we remember our trip and whenever we narrate it to people who did not accompany us. In other words, tourists are the protagonists of their own personal narratives. And tourist maps offer and also signify plot points of those narratives. Now, one way to think about the analogy between tourist maps and narrative is to focus on a tourist map that consciously draws upon an actual literary narrative. And this is a map that came from the first bound edition of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, which was published in 1719. It is arguably the first novel in the English language. It is certainly a proto-novel. That's something we like to debate in literary studies. Now, this map here, which again came with the original edition of Robinson Crusoe, represents to us a physical setting. It was a quote-unquote uninhabited island that, and I quote, was off the coast of Trinidad. It also offers a temporal setting, or at least a temporal setting is implied. Robinson Crusoe spent 28 years stranded on that island in that novel. That is a very long vacation. It took place between 1659 and 1686. Now, the ambiguity with respect to the specific location in the literary text means that the illustrator of that map can invent all kinds of details that is appropriate or enjoyable or entertaining to the map maker and the reader, respectively. A side effect of this ambiguity in the literary story, however, is that modern states, like Trinidad and Tobago, for example, can capitalize on the popularity of the narrative, so long as it remains popular. And, Robinson Crusoe is one of the most enduringly popular, sort of like early English novels of all time. Now, here is an example of how a modern state capitalizes upon that narrative. This is Tobago, Robinson Crusoe's island. Now, you need some context for this map. It was published in 1969, but just a few years earlier, in 1966, Chile made a claim to having Robinson Crusoe's island. Because Robinson Crusoe, the narrative, was based on the real-life experiences, supposedly, of a sailor called Selkirk. And Selkirk was stranded in an island off of the coast of Chile, an island that is called Maza Tierra. So they renamed that island in 1966 Robinson Crusoe Island in order to attract tourism. Well, in 1969, Tobago said, and they decided to rename, at least temporarily, their island as Robinson Crusoe's Island. TNT, in other words, reasserted claim to Robinson Crusoe through this tourist map. Now you should note, I don't presume anybody's age, but a few people in this room might remember that in 1960, Disney went to Tobago. Oh, I love the shake of the heads. Thank you. A few people may remember that in 1960, Disney went to Tobago in order to film Swiss Family Robinson. This is a movie which is based on a book, and the book is based on Robinson Crusoe. It's the reason why the surname of that family is Robinson, right? Based on Robinson Crusoe's name. So, there's already a kind of a claim to that literary tradition or that literary history, right? Now, this map in particular, the one that's published in 1969, explicitly invites the reader or the viewer, if that's the language we want to use, to draw a direct parallel between Tobago and the island from Robinson Crusoe. suggesting to the reader slash viewer slash visitor, or hopeful visitor, that they can experience the fictional narrative by experiencing the real space of Tobago. Now, map makers, in other words, can impose a narrative landscape onto Tobago for tourist consumption. And we can ask ourselves some basic questions, literary critical questions, about how is that narrative landscape represented here, in this space? Well, it's represented at the aesthetic level. So there is an attempt by the map maker to capture the black and white, hand-drawn and hand-lettered map that frequently accompanies 18th and 19th century adventure narratives, for example. In other words, the map looks similar to these traditional maps that were included with bound copies of these stories. It is represented in the iconography used on that map. There is an emphasis on pictorial rather than textual elements. And the map de-emphasizes the man-made so-called civilization of Tobago versus the untouched landscape of Robinson Crusoe's adventures. It's also represented in the labels that are used on the map. There is minimal tourist information conveyed through text. That information is mostly in the form of labels for historic forts and bays and deep-sea fishing. And roads appear on this map, though it may be difficult for you to see, they are not identified by name. How do you navigate a road if you don't know what it's called? Now, this narrative landscape is also in some ways subverted in this map, and academics are all interested in subversion and how, like the texts that we analyze don't do what they're expected to do. So here are a few examples. At the level of character, again, if we want to use these literary concepts in order to analyze these visual, textual representations, Tobago is not an uninhabited island, right? In 1970, the population was nearly 39,000 people. So if the tourist imagines him or herself as Robinson Crusoe, as in that figure in the top left in that little cutout there, if the tourist wants to imagine themselves as Robinson Crusoe, he or she will not encounter cannibals, as in the narrative, but real people. And in fact, the representation we get instead, whereas in the original Robinson Crusoe map, you may see in the bottom left corner, we have cannibals and boats who are arriving on the island. And in this Tobago map, they are replaced effectively with pan players in the bottom left of the map, right? That is not an association that I am deliberately making, incidentally. Now, there's a mermaid, right, in the top right of the map. That's suggesting mysterious waters that are yet to be explored, the kind of fantasy that we allow ourselves to descend in or ascend to when we think about literary texts. But we know that mermaids don't exist in real life. And you are unlikely to encounter, it's true. You are unlikely, anyway, to encounter a mermaid if you were to go on this kind of literary tourism expedition to the island of Tobago. At the level of the temporal setting, we can say that, or rather we can see that there are three different eras of ships that reinforce the temporal paradox of the historical narrative and also the contemporary experience. So on the bottom right corner there, we have a Spanish galleon, right, which is a quintessential pirate-era ship of the imagination. But we also have the T&T ferry, which is sort of in the center left bottom over there. It's hard to see, but it's represented as a steamship. Few of you in the audience who remember this may recall that the SS Tobago and the SS Trinidad, SS stands for steamship, by the way, if you ever see that. They were both decommissioned in 1957. So by the time this map was produced and made available for consumption, steamships were no longer used for that purpose, with the roll-on, roll-off ships that are sometimes used today, right? That's my dig. There's also the modern recreational sailboat, right? It's a little bit difficult to see. It's sort of in the left corner over there, just above Pigeon Point. So we have a representation then of the sort of the contemporary experience of Tobago as an island. That is the kind of ship that we expect to encounter when we actually travel to Tobago, not the Spanish galleon and not the steamship, right? There's also, in the physical setting, the narrative landscape is subverted. Most interestingly, I think, because there is no mention of Robinson Crusoe's cave. which you would think would be a key destination for people who wanted to visit Robinson Crusoe's island in Tobago, right? Other contemporaneous maps from this period do include a label to Robinson Crusoe's cave. So it's not that the cave wasn't identified as such at that time. It's just for some reason the map maker decided not to include that seemingly pivotal location or destination for the literary tourist, as it were. Now, when we talk about theme, and we love talking about theme in literary criticism, we can examine this map, this text, in a whole variety of ways. Robinson Crusoe describes his unintended vacation spot as, and I quote, his island of despair. That's how he represented his island. And there is an insert at the bottom. It looks kind of like, rolled parchment, right? At the bottom sort of center right of the map. That insert provides a brief narrative history of the island of Tobago that highlights violence and uncertainty and hazards, evoking that same sense of hopelessness or despair. This is what the text reads. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Tobago was the cause of repeated disputes, and the island changed hands more than any other in the Caribbean. 11,000 slaves were freed in 1838. A severe hurricane struck in 1847, from which the island never fully recovered, forcing it finally, through economic distress, to amalgamate with the nearby colony of Trinidad in 1868. Now, anyone from Tobago would not describe the island's history and its culture and its vibrancy using those historical events, right? This is a description that consciously evokes despair. And of course, despair is not the emotion that a tourist destination wishes to cultivate in its tourists. You don't want someone to go away from your island feeling despair, right? The distinction here, though, is that tourists can experience these potential sites of despair from the protective distance of history. And that's something that I want you to keep in mind. Now, in conclusion, Dennis Wood, who, Shalane, you had quoted in your presentation as well, in his book, The Power of Maps, he says this about a map, and I quote, "A map space does not contain meanings as much as it makes present images, memories, spaces, and other representations that readers use to interpret it." That is, the map space. Now, tellingly, I think, in literary criticism, we use that same kind of rhetoric when we talk about literary narratives, when we talk about novels and short stories and play texts and so on. That is to say, those literary texts invite us to interpret them in certain ways through their deployment or presentation of literary elements like character and point of view and the physical and temporal setting and plot and theme and so on, those basic literary elements. And good stories involve multiple layers of meaning. They invite us to think things about the narrative and the places and peoples it represents, but they also invite us to feel things, and sometimes they even invite us to believe things about the messages or peoples and places that are communicated in those stories. But ultimately, whether we are reading a book or we're reading a map, we get to decide whether or not we accept that invitation. The invitation that the text, whether it be represented visually or in print, presents to us. And in fact, we can use stories, or indeed maps, to make meaning about the world. That's what we do with stories. That is some of their greatest value. And you too, I want to suggest, can decide whether or not to accept not only the invitations that are presented in this map, to think and feel and believe certain ways about the islands that they represent, but you too can decide to accept whether you accept the library's invitation to visit the West Indiana and Special Collections Unit. Now, when I went into the Special Collections Unit, I had no idea that I'd be looking at tourist maps. I had no idea that I'd be looking at poorly suited tourist maps. I had no idea what I was doing. But that's what every researcher does when they go into a special collections or they go into the archives. And that's why I want to emphasize to you that no matter whether you are a student or a researcher, independent researcher, or a lecturer, you don't go into the special collections oftentimes with a very specific or clear idea of what you want to do. You go there for one of the most extraordinary emotions you might feel in a library, and that is serendipity. Coming across a thing that you never knew existed, coming across a thing that opens up entirely new ways to think about yourself or your country or your world around you. But you can only experience that emotion if you walk through the doors of that special collection. That's the only way it works. So, I would encourage you, accept that invitation, ladies and gentlemen, because those texts are going to be there whether someone looks at them or not. But they only have utility if we use them. They only have value if we use them. So I encourage you to use them. Thanks for your patience.